Ladies and gentlemen, gabestah here. This is the quick guide for heroic Lei Shen. As usual, if you want the full guide with a lot more information and detail, check out the annotation on your screen there. Otherwise, let's get started. For your raid composition, you'll want 2 tanks and 2 or 3 healers. I would strongly recommend 2 healers because the only phase that has high healing requirements is the final phase, and burning through that quickly will help you quite a bit. You'll also want to stack players that have some form of self-immunity cooldown or a large damage reduction cooldown that's not quite an immunity. So anyone with a 90% or higher reduction that can solo static shock during the intermission phase will be very useful. Finally, a Death Knight that can use AE Death Grip to handle the ball lightnings will be very helpful, as well as a Warlock for their portal ability in the final phase to deal with Thunderstruck. So any and all of those are really key to this fight and will help you a lot. The biggest change on Heroic is that once you overload a pillar or a conduit, it will continue to use its ability throughout the remainder of the encounter. So unlike normal where you disable the ones early based on which are more difficult, in Heroic it's the opposite. You disable the ones that you think you can deal with the easiest later on in the fight. The second major change on Heroic is the addition of the Helm of Command ability. This is cast on the intermission phases by Lei Shen. You can see him casting on me right there. And this is a pushback ability that forces you off the platform. To deal with this, you need a form of movement boost, either personal or outside cooldown, or just some form of teleport if possible, and also some form of damage reduction or direct healing from a player because it also deals heavy damage over time. So while there are technically multiple strategies for how you overload the pillars and what order, I'm going to assume that you use the most common strategy, which is the one we're using here. And that's basically to start with north on the first phase. And that's going to be your first overload target. And then you go clockwise from there. So east, then south, and west. Then the second round, you'll start with east and go clockwise again, south, and then finally west. So this will mean that north or static shock is your first overloaded pillar. And that means throughout the remainder of the fight, you deal with static shock. And then after the second phase, you deal with diffusion chain and static shock. But this beats out dealing with empowered overcharge and empowered bouncing bolt, in my opinion. For the timings and positions of phase 1, you can see the complete detailed outline at the bottom there if you want to read through that. But for this quick guide, I'm just going to go over the basics. First and foremost, your range should always be on the far side, stacked up for Thunderstruck. So if you are moving clockwise like we are in the video, your range should start off on the counterclockwise or left side at max range. So you can see on the left of the screen, that's the range position. And then once Thunderstruck targets them, like it's doing there, they just move to the opposite corner so that they'll be in the new far side position for the next platform that we move to. And this just repeats as you move around. The other thing to be careful of is know which platform you're moving to next. So the second platform on the first phase, the range need to be spread for diffusion chain, which will happen right away. And then they stack up after that. Your melee need to watch for the lightning attack that comes down around Lei Shen. You can see where he's casting it if you just look at his facing. And if he casts it at you, just move directly under his model for a moment. And you'll be safe until he's done with the full cast sequence. When you move to the third pillar, everyone should stack up in melee range because overcharge will be cast very quickly. So here you can see overcharge coming up. And we stack in the melee position marked by yellow there. And then the overcharge is guaranteed to be on someone that's in a safe position in melee range, so no one is in danger of getting hit. And then once that hits, your range spread out again to their Thunderstruck position, and so on and so forth. Also keep in mind that you want the energy on the first pillar to be the highest, so you'll move out around 90 energy on that one, whereas the others you're going to move out closer to 80 or so, just like normal. And then the transition to the last pillar on this first phase, there's going to be a lot of raid damage. So your raid needs to make sure they stay far away from Lei Shen as he moves across. Otherwise, they'll be targeted by the lightning attack. As well as there's just a lot of stacks of discharge energy. So use 1 or 2 raid cooldowns and some heal cooldowns on that transition. And then try to taunt the boss from range so he moves very quickly between the 2 spots. So the abilities used on the intermission phases have some specific rule sets that they follow in terms of target selection. And knowing these allows you to set up your positions for your quadrants on these intermission phases. So you can see the full details in the bottom left there if you want to know. But the basics are that your tanks can only be targeted by Helm of Command. Nothing else will target them directly. Additionally, your melee DPS and your mistweaver healer can be targeted by everything except for diffusion chain. And then all your ranged and other non-monk healers are targeted by everything. And then bouncing bolt, of course, doesn't target a player, so it will go on all platforms. So for intermission number 1, the basic assignments, again, will probably be dictated by the raid leader, but the idea here is to follow a few goals or rules, which you can see in the bottom left there. So the first idea is to allow static shock to be soaked by players that are able to solo soak it. So that's where the composition mention of immunities or 90% high reduction abilities are useful. So common setups are to have a tank paired with another personal immunity or someone that can solo a static shock. So a rogue, a death knight, something like that. Melee are preferable, but you can use ranged if needed. Then the other general rule is to force most of your ranged, if not all of them, onto 1 or 2 quadrants. This is because diffusion chain can only target ranged players. So if you focus the diffusion chains onto the platforms with the most players, that'll just give you the most DPS on them. So on the right, you can see the basic setup we used, the quadrants north, east, south, and west respectively. So for the first phase, we had 1 tank and a shadow priest on the north, a tank and a rogue on the east, 3 people on the south, and 3 people on the west. And then number 2 shows in black, shows the second intermission. There's no one on the north because it overloaded, obviously. So then we have 2 tanks and a rogue on the east, 3 more people on the south again, and then the remaining 4 on the west. So you can sort of decide based on your raid composition who is best to help duo with a tank and who needs more help to soak up static shock and stuff. So for the intermission timings and tactics, this is basically how you actually handle your individual quadrant with your fellow teammates. So the first thing to know is that the abilities come in pairs. So the first pair is always overcharge and diffusion chain. So the best thing you can do is decide with your teammates relative positions that you will stand around the inner circle that's in the center of your quadrant. So you can see here that sort of blue and gold circle. I always stand on the right, our warrior always stands on the back left, and our hunter always stands in the front center. By keeping this rough spread position, this allows players to always ensure that they're not close enough to diffusion chain together if you have a valid target on your platform, but you're also at the same time close enough together that when one of you gets overcharge, after diffusion chain goes out, you can step into the overcharge safely. You're always close enough. It also keeps you centered enough that Helm of Command pushback won't instantly throw you off. You have time to react and use your sprint abilities or whatnot. So try to figure out just assignments that you can do with your teammates that you'll always hang out on this side of the circle or whatever. The second thing is to handle the bouncing bolts and Helm of Command, which is the second pair. So similar to the circle positions, you should also have rough quadrant assignments within your quadrant for handling bouncing bolts. So for our platform, I generally get the bolts on the right or the front, and our warrior gets them on the left or the back. Now the exception, of course, is if you have Helm of Command on one of those players, then your third player, if you have 3 players on your platform, needs to be the substitute. So just, again, decide your basic idea. I'm going to always get the front or the right. And this person's going to get back or left or whatever. And then you can just repeat that and you'll get used to it very quickly. This will help you immensely. So moving on to phase 2 timings and positionings. Much of it is the same as before, except now you have static shock constantly that you have to manage, as well as ball lightning, which is a big factor. The basic rule of static shock is if you get static shock, you run into melee range and soak it just with body count. Just soak up, stand with melee, and that'll soak the damage. This goes for ranged and melee alike. Other than that, the basic rule is to handle ball lightning by causing as few spawns to appear as possible. Now, with the exception of the very first ball lightning spawn, all subsequent ball lightning spawns should only have 3 players outside of melee range when they're about to spawn. This will force the minimum number of ball lightnings to appear, which is 3, and then you can deal with them accordingly pretty easily. However, if you have more than 3 players out, which you will have to at the first cast because diffusion chain happens at the same time, then you'll get more ball lightnings, up to a maximum of 6, I believe. So just be aware of that. Generally speaking, you want to spread out for ball lightnings when they're moving around. Use stuns whenever possible and DPS them down first and foremost. They're very dangerous if left alone. And as mentioned in the composition section, if you have a Death Knight that can do AE Death Grip, doing that on all the ball lightnings and then stunning them all for 5 seconds or something is incredibly powerful and will greatly trivialize most of this phase, as well as the end, actually. So transitioning from one section to the next, in this second round, you're actually leveling up the first 2 pillars. So after the first one levels up, the tank will move the boss after the fusion slash knocks him back. And then everyone stacks up in melee again, just like you saw there, so that overcharge is safe. Once overcharge hits, 3 ranged DPS move out to spread ball lightnings, or spawn ball lightnings rather. And then you just go through the whip process one more time. And once whip hits, everyone stacks up in melee once again, because you'll then get another overcharge, and you want that in melee range once more. And then once that overcharge hits, again, 3 range spread out for ball lightning, keeping in mind that if one of the 3 people that goes out for static shock, or goes out for ball lightning, gets static shock, then that player needs to come into melee range and another person go out before ball lightning spawns, so that you maintain that 3 minimum player count. And then after these level up and the lightning whip, again, you'll move the boss with the tank getting knocked back by the fusion slash. So here he goes. And then this last platform, you might want to be careful of your DPS. We found it was best to stop DPS at about 35%, wait for the ball lightning spawns, and then push him to transition around that time. All right, so finally, once you make it through intermission number 2, you start on phase 3. And phase 3 is very chaotic. It's almost primarily about positioning. So on the bottom left, you can see the 5 primary abilities that are used, their cooldowns, and then the timing at the start of the phase when the first one of that ability is used. Essentially what this means, though, is that eventually you will have the abilities Lightning Whip, Thunderstruck, and Ball Lightning overlapping with the overload abilities of Diffusion Chain and Static Shock. And at certain intervals of those overlaps, things can be very dangerous. That said, the most important time is the 3rd Thunderstruck and the 3rd Static Shock. So if you have Static Shock number 3, try to solo soak it by yourself if possible, because you cannot really stack up in melee range. And Thunderstruck is happening around then, so you have to be very careful. Similarly, Thunderstruck number 3 happens around a dangerous time as well, so try to use cooldowns for that if possible. But otherwise, the entire phase is very dangerous. There's tons of damage going on. So rotate your raid cooldowns for every Thunderstruck when possible. And otherwise, it's all about positioning. So if you have enough ranged targets, then the best thing to do is split up your raid 3 on each side, approximately. When Thunderstruck targets one of those ranged groups, that should be around max range from the boss, they move immediately in melee range to the boss and stay there until ball lightning spawns. By doing this, the other group on the other side of 3 players will be the 3 minimum required to spawn ball lightning. If you have a warlock, you can use a warlock portal to greatly trivialize moving after a thunderstruck. It'll help you a lot. But otherwise, you're going to have to do sort of a split-up run-in method. The other thing is ball lightnings still need to be dealt with. You also have diffusion chains, so make sure you spread out when that's about to come off cooldown. You have whip, so you have to dodge that, of course. And as I mentioned, static shock. You have to either stack up with your ranged group if you have at least 3 players near you. If you do not, then you're going to have to solo it or move into melee range. So be very careful when moving into melee range that an ability like Thunderstruck or Diffusion Chain is not about to be cast, because if that's the case, you could cause that to spawn in melee and kill the raid. So just practice those timings, get your positions down, watch the boss mod timers very closely on the phase, and otherwise just focus on your DPS, burn the ads down first and foremost, use CCs, roots, stuns, all that stuff, and then focus the boss second. Make sure you communicate your raid cooldowns with the healers and the rest of the raid, and try to chain them for every Thunderstruck, and then eventually you'll get through it. So that is a quick guide for heroic Lei Shen. As usual, if you enjoyed this, please subscribe, and thank you for watching.